guys, we'll get started. Hi everyone, my name's Caiti. I'm the head of 8 to 10 maths at Clarendon, and I teach VCE maths there. So what I'm going to be talking about today, and you've probably gathered this from the title of the presentation, is how we teach maths at Clarendon. And for me to be able to do this, I'm going to need to start off by giving you a little bit of context around the research that we use. So really simply, at an extremely high level, the way that we teach maths at Clarendon could be explained by this diagram. Our process is really cyclic. What we do is we develop shared resources, we use those in the classroom, and then finally we review the data to inform improvement. But the problem is that when I give you something that's a cycle, it raises a lot of questions about how you actually get started implementing something like this. Because unless you know how your teachers are going to deliver resources, you don't actually know what resources to create. And unless your teachers have the resources, you can't see how they're going to deliver them. So for us, that's where the research comes in. At every stage in the cycle, what we do is we use research to inform what it is we're going to do and what our resources will look like and how our teachers are going to present those. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to start by just giving us a really brief, and I will preface it, it is going to be an extremely brief overview of the research that we use here. And it is worth noting that as a school, one of our major points of difference is that we don't sort of flit around between different ideas or different streams of research. What we instead do is we stick with this really similar idea, and we just look at research that builds upon that. So the first field that I'm going to speak about is process product research. And basically this research was largely conducted in the 60s, and what it was basically people just went into classrooms with clipboards and they looked at what teachers did. So they looked at classroom factors and they looked at teacher behaviours, and they looked at the links between which factors led to higher student achievement. And what sort of happened with this is we found a few factors that just consistently led to higher student achievement. So even though the research was conducted largely in the 60s, it's been corroborated by a lot of evidence recently, PISA studies for instance, and there's a little bit more that I'll get into today. So even though it happened in the 60s, the research is still really useful for us because realistically, student brains haven't changed all that much since the 60s. But also, this is one of the largest scale experiments that's been done in this area. So, essentially, the first thing that sort of came out of this was a higher opportunity to learn. And that doesn't sound revolutionary. If you give somebody more time in the classroom and you give me as many hours as I want, well, of course I'm going to be able to teach everything. And I'll cover it really well. And what this factor really did look at was just the percentage of curriculum material that was covered. Except that that wasn't necessarily what the researchers looked at. It wasn't about whether one teacher had more time than another. It was about how they used the time that they had in the classroom. So that corresponds to things like time on task. That's things like minimising the amount of time between that students are spending moving between activities or doing organisational things or just general wasted time in the classroom. And I find this one really fascinating because I know that Daisy referred to it earlier too, but just the amount of time that I'll sort of have spent, especially in my first year of teaching where I wasn't working here, where I would have spent setting up this big, huge activity and would have spent more time explaining it than my students actually did learning it. The other one that feeds into this really nicely, and I'm going to go over some of these and some of what we do at Clarendon later, but it's classroom routines. Having really nice structures in your classroom, having your students come in and know exactly what they're going to do and when they're going to do it, means that your students come in and they immediately can get started. So again, it's increasing the amount of time in class that you're spending on the activities. And if you increase the amount of time in class that you're spending covering the curriculum material or teaching, then again, you're going to cover more material and of course your students are going to do better. This one I find really interesting. So this is a higher proportion of time spent on whole class learning as opposed to students doing either independent work or as opposed to you working one-on-one with individuals in the class. And I find this one really, really interesting because when I was a pre-service teacher and I was at uni, I got told by my placement teachers I was given a structure. And they said to me, in your lessons you spend 15 to 20 minutes up the front and you lecture at students and you give them worked examples and they copy them down. And then for the next 50 minutes, your students are just going to sit there and they'll work through questions and I'll just circulate the room. And the thing is, in this 50 minutes, it just, I mean, even now, I'm like, logically, it didn't make a lot of sense. In this 50 minutes, I got maybe 2 minutes per student to go over and say, oh, what's your issue, and try to help them, and then that's assuming that my students were even spending their time actually working on the task at hand and weren't chatting to the person next to them. And so it wasn't particularly efficient. But I also realised that I was hitting some common errors here. So assuming that all my students were perfectly, working on their maths and only doing the questions I've set, I was walking around and I was finding that the same errors were coming up over and over again. And in my first year of teaching, which was not at this school, I'd sort of jump up the front and I'd say to my students, all right, I'm going to stop you because I'm seeing this thing come up. And I was doing it all the time. And a lot of those errors, honestly, were because I hadn't taught them properly. But I didn't know that until I circled the room and had a look around. So this is where the research would have been extremely useful because Reynolds and Mausch basically say that what you should do as a teacher is you should deliver the content to your students. You don't rely on a textbook or a slideshow or whatever. You don't rely on that to do it for you. That's your job. So, when I came to Clarendon, I knew that the school employed explicit instruction. And I had this idea in my head of exactly what that looked like. And that idea was that I would stand up the front, kind of like what I'm doing now, and I would just talk in an audience, and my students would be out the back, and they'd be, I don't know, on their computers, or playing games, or falling asleep. Like, I assumed that explicit instruction was you'd stand there and you'd talk at people. But actually, what the research found is that whole class learning should be interactive. So it's still explicit instruction, but the students are doing part of that for you. And so, really, what this sort of does is it feeds into this idea that your curriculum should be teacher-led, and it means that your students are able to respond. You're controlling the pace, you're controlling the delivery, but your students are still involved in it. Now, this all is really, really a very quick summary, and I sort of go over that last one in quite a bit of detail shortly. But essentially, it's things like asking lots of questions, having the students relay content back to you, or just generally engage with the learning. And I mean, the paper sort of describes it in a little bit of detail as just short bursts of teaching, get the students to somehow interact with that again for a really short burst, and continue that over the course of the lesson. And what you'll find out is that's virtually what we do here. So the paper has a lot more factors than this. I'm going to stop us there on these ones just because we've got a lot more to the research base that I'm trying to cover in a really, really quick period. So the next one. I'll pause for a moment just to give you a chance to have a quick read. So a lot of what's found in process product research can be summarised really nicely by Rosenshine. And what Barak Rosenshine's done is he's actually triangulated research from 3 different areas. So he looked into it was cognitive science and cognitive supports, which is essentially scaffolding at a very, very basic level. But he looked into that and he combined all of that research and pretty much just put it into 17 dot points on how you can teach. And the reason that I love this so much is because if as a school you wanted to start doing something like this, or when we have new people who come here, this would be the first thing I would give to them. If I've got a new staff member in the team, I give them our classroom expectations document and I give them Rosenshine's. And I say, those are your 2 main things. Just keep these 2 in your head and you can ignore everything else because this summarises everything that we do. So the next one. Depending on which sessions you've been to today, you might have heard in a bit of detail. The next one that I'm going to go over will be cognitive load theory, and I'm going to apologise in advance because what I'm about to give you is the most basic 2-minute quick explanation of cognitive load theory. So, cognitive load. This is where we draw a lot of our practice from, and honestly, this one is the big game changer for me. So, I'm going to use what is an extremely simplified model, and I actually took the model from Greg Ashman, to explain this. So, the model, it's not perfect, but it's going to work for what we're doing today. So firstly, I have to add in a disclaimer, which is this, and the model that I'm referring to here is only talking about what we're calling new academic stuff. It doesn't refer to anything that's biologically primary. We're referring to new academic stuff only with this. But obviously, when we're teaching in the maths classroom, that's a lot of what we do. So the really simple model for this is that of a bottle. And ideally, what we want is we want everything in our bottle to be stored over here in our long-term memory, which is effectively limitless. But in order to get it over there, we need to pass it through this bottleneck. I'm hoping that that's showing up okay. We need to pass it through the bottleneck. But the bottleneck is constrained in size. It can only fit a certain amount of stuff in it, and not everything that goes into that bottleneck is going to get passed through into your long-term memory. So that bottleneck, and again, at a really base level, I describe it to people who don't know it as essentially being like the processing power of your brain. So it's your working memory, but it's your processing power. It's the part that actively deals with whatever's going on in front of you, or in this case, our new academic stuff. And I give people an example of this that's really basic, which is when you've got somebody and they're driving, and it's it's peak hour, you're on a busy road, you've got a tight parallel path you've got to get into. And what's going on is as people are pulling into it, often they'll turn down the radio. And the reason for that isn't because your eyes and your brain can't, or your eyes and your ears can't work at the same time. The reason is because they were focused so much, they were putting so much of their working memory into doing that parallel path that they couldn't handle having extra stuff going on. There was too much going on in their working memory. So that's the cognitive load. So the thing is, and I'm assuming that a lot of us in here are maths teachers, we know that when we're doing this, or when we're doing maths problems, sometimes we process things and it takes no effort at all. So how does that fit in? Well, the really awesome thing about the long-term memory, or the wider part of the bottle, is that you can call on resources from that pretty much whenever you want, as long as you have a way of accessing them. You can draw on these to be able to process things easier. Here's a question for you. If I asked you this question, without even really thinking about it, most people, I'm assuming, will already know the answer to it. And it didn't really take up any space in your working memory. Didn't occupy your brain for a second. You just went, yep, great, I know the answer. That's it. And that's because you've already processed a lot of problems that are like this one. So it's not that you immediately have memorized 3x is equal to 15 and you know the answer to that specific equation. It's that you've seen lots of equations like that, and so your brain's already done all the processing for you, and it means that then when you do see it, it activates that schema and you can draw upon that and you can solve it in a couple of seconds, if that. However, if I were to walk into a grade 5 maths classroom and I gave the student those same questions, then there's a lot more to it. Firstly, our students are going to need to know what x actually means, and they're going to need to understand that 3x means it's 3 times x, and they're also going to need to understand equivalence and solving, and they're probably going to need to know the times tables, and by the end of that, you still haven't actually taught them how to solve an equation, right? So there's a lot to it, and a lot of these steps are things that we don't consider as experts in the field. So this sort of brings us to the main idea. Number one, what we ideally want to do is we want to store as much stuff as possible in our students' long-term memories. Because if they could, just as easily as we can all go 3x equals 15, as easily as we can all solve that in our heads, if they could do that with lots of different topics in maths, then that's going to make their maths really easy for them. And number two, when we do give them new academic information, we're going to have to do it in a considered way. We have to slowly drip it through so that we're actually giving stuff a chance to pass through into long-term memory. Because if our students, if they're not exposed to it, if they're not thinking about it, then that information is never going to get pushed into their memory. So that brings me to the main point, which is how do we, as a school, take all of this research and all of the other research that we look into and implement this in a classroom? And the first thing we do is we use a shared curriculum. So at Clarendon, in every single subject, not just in maths, in every single subject, what we do is we implement a shared curriculum. And this means that all of my Year 9 maths teachers will teach the exact same lesson with the exact same resources at the same time. And to make sure that this is happening, we use this thing called stepping out, which is basically a fancy calendar that you look at and you go, yep, that's what I'm teaching on this particular day. And you might wonder why we do this, and I imagine that this is going to raise some questions around logistically, how does this work when we have such different classes? Well, what it comes down to is just the principle that as a school, our focus is on making sure that every single one of our students is given the best opportunities. And that means that if there's a resource that's going to be really awesome for one class or one student, then that resource is going to be awesome for everybody. And so we share it. We don't want our lessons and we don't want our teachers to be a lottery. Doesn't matter who's taking you for Year 10 maths, you are going to do the same stuff and you're going to do it really, really well. That's our goal. So the other benefit, I guess, of this system is it means we share our planning as a team. And it means that if one person has an idea or they create a really cool resource, we're all sharing it and we're all able to put all of our efforts into making sure that every lesson is really good. And again, it's sort of a far cry from my prac teaching or when I was teaching up in Queensland before I came here and I was doing it all by myself. And it was a case of me just creating lessons as a means of surviving the next day. Like, that was it. I didn't have any, it wasn't about the quality of them, it wasn't about how you would teach them. It was, I need to rock up tomorrow and have something for my students to do. So, the shared curriculum, that includes things like starter books. And again, it's really worth noting we don't just use these in maths, we use these in English as well. And every single maths lesson and every single English lesson starts with a starter or an activity from your starter book. So, when we go back to the research about by Reynolds and Mausch, they spoke about maximising the opportunity to learn. And this means that every single lesson, my students come in, and if I'm not in the room for whatever reason, they come in and immediately pull out their starter books, they're stored in the classroom, they pull them out, and they start doing maths. And that is really, really awesome if you've ever taught in a school where you're trying to set up a projector and plug things in and control a class and get your students in quietly, and you've got someone coming up to you because they're injured or they've got a problem or they don't have their homework. While my students are there, they're getting themselves set up, they're doing the maths, and I can focus on setting up my projector, making sure everyone's okay, and actually checking homework. This is awesome for a couple of other reasons. So, one of Rosenshine's principles was that you should start every lesson with a review of prior knowledge. And that's exactly what these do. And I will go into them in a moment and actually show you what sorts of things we put in them and how I decided what sorts of things to put in them. Finally though, we use these to help aid students to push content we really, really want into their long-term memory. So, what I've got over here is an example, and I've just taken this one from one of the Year 10 starter books, and I should point out that they do look really different at different year levels. So, what the starter books largely have in them is skills that I want my students to be able to do automatically. This is my equivalent of the 3x is equal to 15. This is all the stuff that I've gone, right, if my students could just do that like that, they'd be awesome. And that'd be really, really helpful. So, for me, it was really a case of having a look and going, right, let's pick out a few key skills for that. We don't always do the same questions, to be really clear. This is one example. Every day isn't going to look exactly the same. So, in this one, and I'll speak to the Year 10 ones to begin with, but I will in a moment, I'll show you some of the Year 8 ones as well. But question 1, it's fairly straightforward. It's just simple memorisation. So we do trig exact values, I might do applying really simple index laws. It's stuff that doesn't require a lot of thinking, but they're the things that I want the students to remember. Question 2 is like factorisation or expansion or solving quadratics. There's always some kind of working with quadratics. And that's chosen because I know that being able to factorise a quadratic, that doesn't just come up in quadratics. That comes up if you're doing cubics or quartics later. That comes up if you're doing probability at year 12. And so by them having these skills and already knowing them, that's going to make my job much easier later on. And question 3 is always some kind of linear work, so finding the equation of a line or solving. Now, when I identified the skills that I wanted to put in these, the first step that I did was I just looked at our planned curriculum for the year. I went to the stepping out document and I went, right, well, what skills? And I just listed them out on a piece of paper. I went, what skills underlie the most number of things that we're going to teach? And the next thing that I did was I also picked out all the skills, and this is where solving sim equations comes in. I picked out the skills that I'll stand up the front of a class, and they'll come up kind of here and there in a lot of topics, but not all that often, and you don't tend to spend a lot of time teaching them. But they're the skills where I stand up the front and I say to my students, oh, come on guys, you know this, you've done it back in term 2 of last year, come on, remember it. And so it's that stuff. It's the things that are a little bit too much for them to remember, but I really, really need them to know to be able to access other content. This is really challenging because there is a lot of stuff that's necessary in maths, and there's a lot of stuff that I would love to make automatic for them. And so I used this principle to guide my decisions when I made the books. I know that things need to show up regularly enough that they're going to be stored in my students' long-term memory, that they're rehearsing the skills enough that those are going to become automatic. And unfortunately, that means that I can't have my students do absolutely every skill I want them to do. And so it did become a case of me on my piece of paper trying to pick out and prioritise what I thought the key skills were. From there, and the mapping that I'm going to show you is not from the Year 10 document, it's from the Year 8 one because it's a little bit more interesting. But then what I did was I created and I do apologise, I've just screenshotted it, so it is an ugly map, but I just mapped out the skills I wanted them to use. When I did this, what I started with was I picked out a couple of my key skills, and I put all of the skills in individually. So one of the ones that comes up a few times in there is rotations about the origin. And the reason that that came up is because I know historically, based on our data and based on all of the assessments the students have done, I know that our students aren't necessarily great at remembering how to rotate an object or a point or a shape. They're not good at doing rotations about the origin. And I wanted to work on this. So when I put it in, when I first put a skill in, especially if it's something they haven't seen for a while, I try to put it in 2 or 3 days in a row when they first see it, so that then we have an opportunity to teach it and reteach it and fix it up. And then I begin to increase the gap. So then, I might leave it and I might give them 1 day where they don't see that skill, and then we'll do it again. And then the next time I might give them 2 or 3 days before they see it again. So gradually over time I'm increasing the amount of time between each skill. Now we get into our core lesson content. This is what the bulk of our maths slides look like. So this is where we get to use the explicit instruction. And what this looks like for us is just a series of what we call problem pairs. And this is nothing like, I would imagine most places do some form of I do, we do, you do, etc. So this is definitely not something unique to us. But we know from Rosenshine that whenever we're teaching something new, we should model it to our students. And what we should do is we should employ active teaching, we need to have interactive lessons. But first, to do that, we need to show our students how to do a problem. Again, when I first did this, and when I first came to the school, I was like, this is silly. I do a problem and then I give my students one that's almost identical. Of course they're going to be able to do it. And now that I've taught here for a little bit, I really challenge that because they absolutely cannot do something just because you've shown it to them. And you'll sort of realise quite a bit about your own teaching when you begin to do things like this. It sounded really counterintuitive to me at first. And when I say it out loud now, it's probably not going to come across that way. At first, I was really like, I just don't understand. You show them something, Why would I teach them something I want them to do? That was my logic. Why would I teach them something I want them to do? Why would I stand up the front, give them an example, and then give them the exact same thing and go, now you guys do it? Well, that's because that actually does make logical sense. It's just in my head, I was like, that feels stupid. It feels like if I've shown you, you know it, and I've given you the answer. So what we do is, if we want our kids to know it, we show them first. That's it. That is that's the key to our explicit instruction here, is we show them first. When we do these problem pairs, we make sure that they match up. So in their style, they're going to be really similar. In both of these questions, you can see that I'm using quite simple numbers in both. The skill's exactly the same. The you do is no more complex than the I do. This means that if I'm teaching my students to find the gradient of a straight line, I'm not going to do a positive one and then ask them to do a negative one, because that's a different skill. It's more complex. They might be dealing with double negatives suddenly in a question. They might not actually, if I'm teaching it using rise over run, they might not actually know that they need to make it a negative. When we implement these with a really specific method. So when I do this, I've already said, I found this a really silly thing at first, and I thought it just didn't make sense. And I realised through formative assessment that just because I've shown it doesn't mean my students will know it, and it doesn't mean that everybody will get it. So back when I first started teaching, I used to do my formative assessment pretty much entirely as exit passes. And if you've used exit passes at all, you'll know that they're pretty inefficient. They take a really long time to mark. I was going home every day and marking maybe 80 different exit passes for students, and the feedback I was giving students was delayed. If I don't see a class for 3 or 4 days, then they're not going to get that feedback for 3 or 4 days. And in that time, what I've done is I've reinforced a lot of misconceptions. If my students were doing the questions wrong right from the get-go, then they've then done, that 50-minute chunk in my lesson. They've done that where they've been doing it wrong the entire time to get to the exit pass. Then they've gotten past that, and they've gone home and they've done their homework and they've done that wrong, and they've completely learned the wrong method. Or they've learned a misconception. So, when I came to Clarendon, you can imagine in my interview my relief when I got told that I would no longer have to do any paper exit passes anymore. But I would also do way more formative assessment than I had ever done. So what we use is we use responsive teaching in the classroom. The first thing I do is, using those problem pairs, I would explicitly model, or I'd use explicit teaching to model a problem. I'll show my students how to do it, really straightforward. And then with that you do, what I'm going to do is I'll get my students to do it, but I don't get them to do it on their books or on their piece of paper. I get them to do it on a mini whiteboard. And often when they're doing it on their mini whiteboard, they'll do it line by line, so I can check in at every step and make sure that it's right. Now, ideally, what's going to happen is I'm going to teach a problem to the class, I'm going to give it to them, I'm going to model it, they'll copy it down, and then I'll say to them, all right, you do the you do problem on your boards, show me what you've got, 3, 2, 1, they'll all hold them up, and ideally everyone's going to get it perfect, and we have a really high success rate and everything's great. And sometimes that is going to happen. And so when that happens, what you're going to do is we'll echo it back to our students. I'll say, yeah, great, the answer is 5. Maybe I'll give a little bit of an explanation, or maybe I'll call on a student and say, hey, tell me, how did you get that? Or why is the answer this? And at that point, after we've done that, we move on. You move on to your next skill. You might do a little bit more practice, but you're probably just going to go, no, I'm satisfied, my students know it, so there's no point spending more time on it. So you move on. Now, ideal world, that's all the time. But what I found is that's often not the case. And usually the first time you teach something, especially if it's something I've never taught before, I'll get a not so high success rate. Now I should say here, I've put here low success rate. That's not strictly true. For me, sometimes a low success rate is anything below 100%. There's a skill, if it's fundamental to my lesson, I need all of my students to know it, I'm not going to be satisfied if only 80% do. So when we do get a low success rate, because I've been monitoring it on boards, and ideally I've been doing it line by line. My students will hold up their boards and I'll do a scan and I'll look for whatever the common error is or the misconception. And really annoyingly, usually it's something that either I haven't said or something that I've worded really badly and I've accidentally spread a misconception in my class. That's usually the case. And so when that happens, I've identified what it is. And then what I do is I correct that. And often that just means yelling it out to the students. So it could be yelling out, hey, quick, on your whiteboards, tell me if you're doing a scale factor for area, what is that? Oh, it's k squared. Oh, there you go, now fix up your answers. So you give them the chance to retry it. You might give them a prompt in the question. Sometimes I'll ask them a question and I'll have worded it terribly and I just go, yeah, let me ask that again. And at a very worst case, you reteach it. You go to the you do problem and you show them how to do it, or you show them how to do the 1 or 2 or whatever it was lines that they'd messed up. And then once we've done that, we don't just go, okay, cool, I've retaught it to them so they're all good. What we do is we move back to the top and we either show them another problem again, or we ask them another problem and we check for understanding. So we repeat the process until we finally get back down to your high success rate. Really, really simply. If you're in the classroom and you want to know what your students know, the awesome thing about mini whiteboards is you can just ask them. So when I get to my learning intention, if it's a year level where I haven't taught the year before, and I go, oh, I don't know if they've ever seen this before, I might circle the word gradient and say, hey, on your whiteboards, tell me, what's the formula for gradient? What's your definition of gradient? You know, list 2 or 3 things you know about it. It's fine if you give me a blank. Oftentimes, though, the information that your students give you, or at least for me, it really challenges, it challenges both my perceptions of what I thought my students could do. And sometimes that's in a really good way. Sometimes I think my students can't do something and they can, and they're awesome at it, and that's really great. Other times it goes the opposite way. I'll stand up in front of a class and I'll think I've just done the most awesome explanation ever, and when I get to the end, I come to the realisation, or when I ask them the question, I come to the realisation that actually I didn't explain it very well because most of them have it wrong, or didn't understand what I've just said, or I've spent way too much time on this super fun explanation that's distracted from the core of what I was actually trying to teach. What I love about this system is that I've had classes before who realistically, they're starting at a much earlier point in their development mathematically. And with those classes, had I not been using mini whiteboards, I would have stood up the front and I would have gone, right, well, I assume that you can do this and this, but this other thing is way too hard, so we're not going to do it. But I've done extension work with students who are in these classes before, on several occasions, because they might get the stuff that's in front of you. Well, I've also had the opposite, where I've walked into a room and assumed students will know something because we've learned it before or we've taught it to them before, and they don't. So the idea is that every single lesson, your students are the ones who are giving you the information that controls how you teach. Now, I've already said we all work from the same PowerPoints. We all do the same thing at the same time. So how is that going to work if I get a class that, that is really, really great at doing this particular thing and we can move on quickly, and so we're moving through between different concepts, and maybe another class is sitting there going, we've got no idea what's going on. How can we all do that using one magical PowerPoint? Well, we do that with 3 colours of slides. So our first colour. Our orange slides represent things that we call essential examples. These are all of your new core skills. And these new core skills are all of the things where I might go, you know what, I'm ready to move on, my students understand it, and you can see that they're pretty easy to see. The other thing is, this means that all of our teachers cover the same core content. The orange slides, and there might be, I don't know, between 3 to 5 in most lessons, give or take. That's the content that you have to cover with your class. So as a teacher, we're all covering the same general stuff by the end of the lesson, just maybe with different amounts of practice of different skills. These also form our student notebooks. Our students copy down these examples. This is where I do most of my modelling. Students will copy them down into their notebooks and they can refer back to them. The next slides. These are our regular slides and they make up the bulk of our lesson. So they're your problem pairs that we've seen before. And the way our lessons are structured is largely you've got an orange slide and then a series of white slides following them, with the idea being that that's extra practice. And so if you need to, you can work through as many of those slides as you want. And you can remodel and reteach, or you can check if your class really does understand it or if the first time was just a fluke. But if you're pretty confident that your students know this skill, then you can also skip them. And so we've got the rule that the white slides are skippable. You don't want to do them, or you know that you still, I shouldn't say you don't want to do them, you know your students don't need you to do them. You don't do them, you move on. Finally, our next one are our blue slides. Our blue slides are our solution slides. They are not answer slides. Our blue slides show our agreed methods as a school for how we're going to do a problem. So they're fully worked examples that all teachers need to follow. So when I'm showing my students how to do something, I don't walk in and just decide what method I feel like teaching on the day. I teach the method that is set out in the slides for me. And in a moment, I'll sort of come to this one in a little bit more detail. But for us as a school, these slides happen after every single one. After every orange slide, you've got a blue slide that shows you how we do it. After every white slide, you've got a blue slide that shows you how we do it. So we're all teaching. Same slideshow, same methods. But how do we know those methods are any good? Because if we're all doing the same thing, then if that method's not great, all of us are going to be teaching something in a not great way. So, this is what takes me to how we constantly improve. After all of our teaching is done, what we do is we assess our students. And we assess them on all the skills and all the content that they've been taught. And with that, we then review the data. So what we do is we split up the data. So what I've done is I've taken averages here, and I mean, we've got a program that does this, but you can use Excel. What we do is we split up the data by different classes. And we split it by the number of marks that they've gotten on every single question. And we all meet once every 2-ish weeks, and we sit down and we review the data together. And what we're looking for is areas where one class has performed either better than what we would have expected, or they've performed particularly well on a question. So we're looking for the areas where people have done well, where students have done well. So we call this process our phase 2 process. And when we found this area where someone's done well, and it's only when people have done well, we'll turn to that teacher and we'll go, hey, can you stand up the front and can you teach us this question in the exact same way that you taught it to your students? And as that person's up there teaching, the rest of us in the team will sit down and we'll watch and we'll look for what they did that was different. Now, they've used the exact same method as the rest of us. So what they've done that's different is in those tiny, tiny little details. It's often things like somebody drew like an arrow circling something or moving it to a certain point, or it could be that someone had a catchphrase that they yelled out to their class. It's little tiny details that people did that meant that their instruction was slightly more effective. And so that's great. Everyone in the room knows, everyone in the room goes away and goes, yep, that's great. But we want to make sure that this gets captured properly. So what we do is we take whatever that effective practice was and we write that into the unit for next year. And so often that means updating those blue solution slides. Not always, but often it means updating the blue solution slides to capture whatever information we've taken from that. So in summary, that model really does encapsulate quite well what it is that we do. Because it is a cyclic process. We know that our teachers will stand up the front and they might ask 100 mini whiteboard questions or more in a lesson. And so we prepare for that when we develop our resources. And we make sure that when we do those shared resources, there's enough stuff in there that every teacher with different classes can all work through it, and that based on what data you're seeing in front of you at the time, you've got enough stuff that you can work with, or we often say you can choose your own adventure in the classroom. Our teachers deliver it. We use the same methods, and then with those same methods, we then use the data to constantly make improvements so that over time, things are getting better. Really crucial to this is actually having teams where you've got a culture of learning. When we've got the data up in front of everyone, everybody who sits in the room knows you're there to learn. And your class will have done really well on one question and not so well on another. But that's fine, because you're about to learn how to do it. And so you'll be able to do it better next time. Do we have any questions? Yeah?
Could you flip back to the data that you use to inform those staff meetings and speak to how you actually collect that data? Is it teachers marking individual questions, uploading it themselves, and how does that sort of come into a teacher's workload?
Yeah, so when we do assessments, we have, in the maths department, we have one person in the team and we share it around. One person in the team will do all the marking for every student. And so once they've done the marking, we then just enter it into, either a spreadsheet, or we've got our own spreadsheet system here, but we enter it into a spreadsheet and it will automatically spit this out, but again, it's just taking averages on Excel. And so in terms of how it's fitting into someone's workload, because we're doing shared work, you're not writing every lesson. So we don't have staff who go in and every day you've got to write your lessons. The expectation is that you're preparing, and to prepare for lessons here, what you're doing is you're working through and making sure you're familiar with the methods you're going to use. But that's a lot less work, at least for me, that is a lot less work than what I was doing having to create resources from scratch. So that's the idea, is it's constantly shared amongst the team. Does that answer it?
Yeah, brilliant, thank you.
Anyone else? Yeah?
Yeah, so with the stuff that you develop, I love that team approach, but how do you align it so that the methods carry out throughout the levels? Like, is there that vertical alignment as well?
Yeah, so between different year levels, do you mean? Yeah, so in terms of getting stuff to match up between year levels, and look, this is still a work in progress. To be really clear, like as a school, we are not perfect at this. This is just what we do, and we are still always improving it. But we've got people who operate between different teams. And so usually what will happen is, you'll have someone who's teaching in two teams in adjacent year levels, and they'll go, hey, hold up, I see that we're about to teach using this method, but last year we actually taught the year 7s using a different one. And so usually someone will point it out. Yeah?
So for younger year levels, it's easier to break down mathematical concepts into discrete skills.
Yes.
I suppose you can do that in VCE, but a lot of the time in VCE, people want to practice exam questions, which integrate multiple different skills as well. I'm wondering, how well does your approach actually translate to that type of problem?
Yeah, right. So, well, in terms of VCE, we use the same approach in every year level in maths, right? So when we're doing VCE maths, do you mean specifically, are you talking like the starter skills, or?
I'm thinking about practicing exam questions.
Yeah, so what we do is we'll write questions that either model exam questions or are based off what we know about exam questions. So it could be in the way that they're written, it could be in the content that they contain. And then what we do is, we'll model those questions, and then we'll give students either past exam questions or what we'd call exam style questions. Yeah, does that kind of answer it? I don't know if I've covered it enough.
Sort of. My hunch was that it might be more difficult when there's more words in a question, more details, more different topics that are required to actually cover and connect.
More steps.
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking.
Yeah, right. So we've got, there's a couple of things here. So one of them is, in terms of our problem pairs, if we've got questions that are really complex or have a lot of steps, we might choose to, and this will sort of depend on the question, we might choose to do it step by step with our students. And as I said before, even when I'm modelling a really simple problem with my class, they'll often do it line by line. They're not going to I don't just say, okay, well, I've taught it to you, go off and do a whole problem, because that's a really good way of ending up in a bit of a mess anyway when you look around at whiteboards and they're all very different. But yeah, when it comes to more complex problems, we might do it bit by bit where it's, all right, identify, I'm just thinking of like year 12 probability where you might get an essay kind of question where it's massive and there's a lot of text. That's a case of us modelling, well, this is how I go through and I pull out the information. All right, here's your question, go through, pull out the key information, show me your annotations. Then we might go, all right, well, part A says do this. Okay, and it could be what CAS function are you going to use is a common one that I'll ask. Or it could just be, I'll show you this bit by bit. So I recently did a year 12 one with my class where we did part A, the students did part A of a problem. I did part B, the students did part B. Yeah, I'll go to you first.
Do you know if your junior school uses a similar approach?
They do, yes, yeah. We're streamlined right across the school. I don't know about, and I should add in, I don't know about the junior school in a lot of detail, so I know that it's a work in progress, but yeah, I definitely know we are at the very least all working towards the same thing, so we will all be doing it if we're not already. Yeah?
What are the numbers under, say, 1A, 1B represent?
Those are the number of marks for the question. So where under 1B it says 3, that was a 3-mark question.
And so if you're getting a 2.67 as the average, how do you agree on what gets half a mark, what gets 1 mark?
We have a mark scheme ahead of time that's already decided. We don't do half marks. We've got a mark scheme ahead of time and we just, because we've got one person marking, it's consistent. I'd love to say if people in the team disagreed about mark schemes, that in my experience in maths does not happen all that often. Usually a maths mark scheme is fairly straightforward. This line is worth a mark. If they showed it, they get one. If they didn't, they don't. Like it's a fairly binary thing for us. Yeah, up the very back. And then I might need to finish up.
How much independent practice do your students do and at what time?
Yeah, independent practice for our students is virtually all homework time. They don't tend to do a lot in the class, and I can justify that really easily by saying, for the students who are in my classroom, I always go, would it be more beneficial for them to work alone right now or to work with me seeing what they do? And I can't think of an example where me not seeing it would be more beneficial. So they do their independent practice at home. So if you've got more questions, I'll hang around for lunch, but I will let people go. I'm not going to keep you in here. Thanks for coming. And yeah, do